On May 19, 1536, a woman knelt before the executioner at the Tower of London. She had been Queen of England. She had changed the religion of an entire nation. She had given birth to a future queen. And now, with fewer than 1,000 days on the throne, she would be beheaded by order of her own husband. Anne Boleyn raised no armies, fought no battles. Yet she toppled a pope, broke with Rome, and rewrote European history, simply by being who she was. England, in the 1520s. Henry VIII had reigned for over a decade, and his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had produced only one surviving child, Mary. Without a male heir, the Tudor throne was at risk. The English court was a minefield of ambition, betrayal, and intrigue. It was in this environment that Anne Boleyn, educated in France, refined, intelligent, returned to England around 1521 and entered the service of Queen Catherine as a lady-in-waiting. Anne Boleyn was born around 1501, the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious diplomat, and Lady Elizabeth Howard. She spent years at the French court, absorbing cultural refinement, a love of poetry and music, and an intellectual independence rare for women of her time. Unlike women of her generation, Anne debated theology, read forbidden Reformation texts, and held her own opinions. When she returned to England, she was a woman who did not fit the expected mold. Around 1526, Henry VIII turned his attention to Anne. She had refused to be his mistress, unlike her sister Mary, who had had an affair with the king, and demanded marriage. And Henry, completely obsessed, spent the next 6 years attempting to obtain an annulment of his marriage to Catherine. Throughout this period, Anne was kept close to court, accumulating power and influence. Enemies called her the Great Whore. Allies saw her as a queen in waiting. In 1532, Henry conferred upon Anne the title of Marchioness of Pembroke, an unprecedented act for an unmarried woman. It was a clear signal that marriage was imminent. That autumn, the two traveled together to France, where Anne was received as a queen-in-waiting. Back in England, around November 1532, Anne and Henry finally consummated their relationship. In January 1533, they married in secret. Anne was already pregnant. Who was Anne Boleyn beyond the king's lover? Historical records describe a woman of magnetic presence, not conventionally beautiful, but possessing rare intelligence and charisma. She had intense dark eyes, long dark hair, and a sixth finger on one hand, an anomaly her enemies would use as evidence of witchcraft. She was passionate about music and poetry, patronized artists and scholars, and championed Protestant reform before it was politically convenient to do so. And had powerful allies, her father Thomas Boleyn and her uncle the Duke of Norfolk, but also implacable enemies. Catherine of Aragon refused to accept the annulment until her death. Catherine's daughter, the future Mary I, despised Anne with fervor. Cardinal Wolsey, who initially tried to help Henry secure the annulment, was later brought down, partly through Anne's influence. Thomas Cromwell would initially be her ally before becoming her executioner. In June 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey in a lavish ceremony calculated to impress Europe. 4 months later, in September 1533, Elizabeth was born. Henry was devastated, he wanted a son. The coronation's joy was short-lived. Anne suffered at least 3 subsequent pregnancies that produced no surviving son. With each loss, her position at court weakened and Henry's patience ran out. In January 1536, Catherine of Aragon died. That same month, Anne miscarried, possibly a male fetus. Henry was already openly courting Jane Seymour. Thomas Cromwell, who had once supported her, now saw Anne as a political obstacle. In April 1536, a secret investigation was opened. On May 2, Anne was imprisoned in the Tower of London. The guards who escorted her were the same men who years earlier had accompanied her as queen. The charges were extraordinary: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn, and alleged conspiracy to murder the king. Modern historians are virtually unanimous: the charges were fabricated by Thomas Cromwell. No real evidence was presented. The 5 accused were tortured into confession. George Boleyn and the other 4 were executed on May 17, 1536. And was tried 2 days later by a tribunal presided over by her own father. And was unanimously convicted. On the morning of May 19, 1536, she climbed the scaffold at the Tower of London. Her final speech was eloquent and dignified, without a single word of accusation against Henry. A specially imported French executioner severed her head with a single sword stroke. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. And was around 35 years old. Her daughter Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old. Alongside Anne, 5 men were executed on the fabricated charges: Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton, and George Boleyn, Anne's brother. Smeaton, a court musician, was the only one who confessed, likely under torture. The rest maintained their innocence to the end. Thomas Boleyn, Anne and George's father, survived losing 2 children, having served as the judge who condemned them to save his own skin. Anne's trial lasted just 1 day. No concrete evidence was presented. Witnesses were intimidated. Confessions extracted under torture were contradictory. Even the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, who despised Anne, wrote that the charges seemed forced. Cromwell orchestrated everything with brutal efficiency, eliminating a political peace that had become inconvenient. The law was an instrument of political murder dressed up as justice. In Henry's England, the official narrative was law. Anne's death was announced as justice for the crime of treason. Anyone who publicly questioned it risked their own head. On the European continent, however, opinion was very different. Erasmus of Rotterdam and other intellectuals viewed the trial as a scandal. Pope Paul III used the case as further proof of Henry's moral depravity. But within England, silence was absolute and mandatory. For decades after her death, Anne Boleyn was erased from England's official history. Her portraits were destroyed or hidden. Her name was spoken with caution. Only with the reign of her daughter Elizabeth I, which began in 1558, was Anne gradually rehabilitated. Elizabeth never spoke publicly about her mother, but preserved her coat of arms and memory in subtle ways. Anne's reputation would only be fully restored centuries later. Anne Boleyn's impact on history is immense and frequently underestimated. Without her, the Protestant Reformation in England might not have happened as it did, or at least not so quickly. She patronized religious reformers and champions of the English Bible. Her daughter Elizabeth I would reign for 44 years and transform England into a world power. And was also one of the first women to publicly challenge the male power structures of early modern Europe. Anne Boleyn was a woman who refused to accept the role society had assigned to her, and was destroyed for it. Not for any crime, but for being inconvenient to power. Her story echoes across so many women throughout history who were eliminated, silenced, or defamed when they dared to occupy spaces not reserved for them. The mechanism is always the same: crimes are invented, evidence is fabricated, and justice becomes theater. Anne Boleyn reigned for fewer than 3 years. Yet she forever changed England, the faith of a nation, and the course of European history. Not through force, but through her refusal to bend. She died with dignity. Her daughter became one of the greatest queens the world has ever known. And she, the woman history tried to erase, became immortal. If you enjoyed this video, like it and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.